Welcome to another episode of the CPG Guys podcast. Our hosts, Sri Rajgopalan, Peter V.S. Bond, and Brian Gildenberg, explore how brands and retailers engage consumers in an increasingly digitally driven world. And now, here are the CPG Guys.
Hello and welcome to the CPG Guys podcast. I'm PVSB, and when I'm not co-hosting this podcast, along with my partners Sri and Brian, I serve as Partnership Acceleration Lead at Flywheel Digital, the leading managed services business that helps brands grow their e-commerce. Joining me for today on our conversation is my fellow co-founder of the CPG Guys. Please listen to his daughter's music at rearaj.com. That's RHEARAJ.com. He resides practically in the shadow of Chavez Ravine, where my beloved Dodgers are poised to win the NL West division yet again and pursue a viable path to the Fall Classic. Well, we'll let Sri talk about the New York Yankees. He'll probably mention something about 27 World Series. But please join me in welcoming my unindicted co-conspirator in this podcast scheme. He's the man known as Sri. Hey, Sri, what's going on? Thought I wouldn't mention the Yankees.
I love your choice of words, unindicted co-conspirator in this game.
I thought it was culturally apropos.
That word's to be in the news. It's like a popular hashtag these days, but I'm excited for today's episode because our guest, I recently saw this guest just 2 weeks ago and we casually started bantering data analytics, etc. I asked and she was nice enough to say yes. And we're doing this within 2 weeks, which rarely happens. So I'm grateful for our guests and looking forward to the conversation too.
All right, Sri, thank you so much. I really appreciate the feedback. I noticed you didn't want to take on the baseball conversation, but that's okay. Before we get to our guest, I want to remind everyone to subscribe to our podcast on your favorite platform, major or minor. And particularly if you use Apple or Spotify, please give us a rating. The star rating actually helps feed the algorithm and makes our podcast more findable. We're really excited and honored to be rated the number one CPG podcast for 2 years running, according to FeedSpot, one of the leading podcast ranking authorities. And Sri, I think I shared with you today, I noticed that on Chartable, with a much broader category definition, we're actually in the top 100 marketing podcasts in the US. That's pretty huge. And we're also glad at least on the FeedSpot top 40 ranking. Sounds like we're the top of the pops in Britain here, Sri. But our sister podcast, CPG Scoop, CPG Guys Fast Forward, hosted by Brian Gildenberg, and of course the FMCG guys, we're all in the top 40 now. So really great to have such esteemed colleagues in that area. So we're also, I should mention, very happy to be formal sponsors of Next Up, formerly known as Network of Executive Women, whose mission it is to advance all women in business and to promote the cause of gender equality in the workplace. Sri appeared on stage a few weeks ago at Next Up's Executive Forum in Austin, Texas. And all three of us are actually going to appear at the Next Up Summit happening in Chicago in September. Links to our podcast, our sister casts, our landing page on Next Up. That makes us official, Sri. We have like our own extension at nextupisnow.org. You can find them in the digital liner notes of this episode. 90% of people listen on a mobile device. Just toggle over, find the hyperlink, and click there. So when we get to our guest for this episode, I met her over a decade ago when I joined dunnhumby, the customer data science division of Tesco. At that time, dunnhumby was operating a joint venture in partnership with Kroger. Though our guest first made the national stage when Barbara Bush, the late First Lady, came to Cincinnati and dined at Skyline Chili. We're going to include a link in the liner notes of this episode showcasing our guest's incredible hospitality skills, slinging her a cheese coney. Yes, you didn't think I'd bring that up. I have that bookmarked for just such an occasion. And by the way, if you haven't been to Skyline, it's a Cincinnati delicacy. You just kind of have to go there. Lisa's experience in CPG retail is really top-notch, with roles at notable companies like ConAgra, Miller, and Unilever before joining dunnhumby, where she ultimately led the global CPG practice before joining Sagamantha, then Symphony Retail AI. In April of 2019, I ran into Lisa at the Merchandise Mart in Chicago, where I was working at the time. I think it was at Pret a Manger. I think that was the exact restaurant we ran into each other. And, she advised me that she was going to take a role as VP Customer Insight for merchandising at Albertsons, hired to jumpstart their efforts to embed customer into their operating model before the company became publicly traded in 2020. Her role has expanded as her influence and team grew through the last 5 years, moving her team into and out of emerging growth pillars to include digital, e-commerce, data products, and even marketing. She now serves as the executive head of customer enterprise and marketing analytics, reporting to the CMO, and recently relocated from Idaho to sunny Southern California. Oh my. In June of 2023, she was named by Progressive Grocer to an elite group known as the top executive women in grocery retail. Please join Sri and me in welcoming to the podcast my dear friend, Lisa Kinney. Lisa, how are you? How you doing?
Hi, I'm truly fantastic, Peter. Thank you both for hosting me today. Although I must admit my trip to Petco this past Friday, which was my first experience in that incredible stadium in San Diego, was quite painful as I watched the Padres get looked on a little bit by our friends in LA. It was...
I was happy about it. At least it wasn't the Reds, right?
True. Although I'll always still be a Reds fan at heart. I can't take Cincinnati out of me. So it's wonderful to see you on the screen. Thanks for the kind introduction.
No worries. Hey, I appreciate you making the time to speak with Sri and me. We've had quite a number of your colleagues join us in prior episodes. No, Christy Argelin, I'm going to say right off the bat, this episode does not count towards the number of episodes needed to earn you a CPG Guys varsity jacket. So just, Christy, I don't want to get any emails from you saying, when am I getting my jacket? You have to earn that on your own. It's not a collective earnings potential. But anyhow, we're looking forward to talking to you, Lisa, today about all things analytic in this digitally driven world. Before we get to the questions Sri and I have prepared, I think it'd be good if you could provide us with an overview of your current role at Albertsons Companies.
Sure. I'm happy to do that. You know, my current role at Albertsons is, you kind of alluded to, it's taken many shapes and forms over the past several years. And that certainly has gone hand in hand with a lot of the executive team and business growth pillars that have come to light here at Albertsons. Been quite a transformative journey for many years now. But today, I would say my role is best described as sitting in the epicenter of the business. So we sit really in the epicenter with a dedicated team that really are here to drive really deep institutional knowledge of the customers and the markets we compete in. And that seems very broad, but let me boil that down a little bit further for you. I'd say our efforts are primarily designed to inform, predict, and advise on how to win in an ever-changing market landscape. And how we do that is we work to identify shifts. We bring that information to the business with sized opportunities or implications. We bring that to bear oftentimes weekly with a broad set of constituents. And really, we try to sit at the forefront of strategy and planning. I would say we work most with the most senior levels of the organization, while we also in parallel are working with the full organization around what are the right tools, the right data models, the right frameworks to measure, plan, and scale. So we're a little bit of all things data analytics and strategy, but really sit in the center to try and guide the organization in the right direction.
Thank you for that overview, Lisa. As I mentioned earlier, the digital liner notes of this episode have a lot of hyperlinks. We're going to include your link to your LinkedIn profile, Albertsons LinkedIn page, and of course, your corporate website, so our listeners can browse while they're listening to our melodic voices in this exciting discussion. So let's get to the questions. You okay with that, Lisa?
Sure, let's get going.
All right. So I think if you and I took a 23andMe DNA test, we'd both find that we had a little bit of Clive and Edwina in our DNA, right? That's an inside joke for people who've been in Dunnhumby.
Who has more Clive and who has more Edwina?
We're just going to leave it at that.
What are y'all talking about?
You don't need to know. It's a need to know basis, Sri, and clearly you don't.
Remember the CPG guys, we demystify all these acronyms.
Clive Humby and Edwina Dunn. That's Dunnhumby. Most people don't know that, but that's where the name of the company came from.
I had no idea, but you solved the mystery. I always wondered why Dunnhumby is like the name. Now I got it.
There you go. So I guess that's just a precursor to saying customer-centric insights and analytics are really at the heart of your professional experience, as it's been mine. What drew you to this field, and what types of data sources do you think is being very central to a retailer's ability to establish these foundational business intelligence capabilities that you see as driving success?
That's a big question. Lots in there.
It is.
Lots to unpack. But I'm going to go ahead and date myself. When you asked how did I get started, I started by answering an ad in the paper. And it was for a trade marketing administrator. And this was honestly 30 years ago. I know. But I started as a baby in this industry. But
at 8 years old, wow.
So I was a good old 19-ish, and I didn't know what a trade marketing what it was. I certainly didn't know what Ragu Vandenberg's Foods was. I just knew they were nearby, and it was going to be easy to get to. And I was graciously hired by what was newly formed Kroger team, who was one of the very few CPG organizations that were starting the centralization process with Kroger. And that was even before category management was a thing. So anyway, I'm going to fast forward. Little did I know that this one job at the age of 19 was going to be the beginning of my career. So I guess I would say it was a bit accidental and a bit of destiny. I learned a few things that I was kind of good at storytelling with data. I was curious enough at that young age to be willing to take on anything that was, given to me. And so here I am. It's been quite the ride. So going back to a couple of the other pieces of your question, I'll start by saying most retailers aren't lacking data or really tools for that matter. And all data sources can be valuable. But what I have learned, and especially being inside the retailer versus outside consulting retailers, which Peter, you and I did a bit of back in the day, is that really data is only as good as the organization in terms of how they operationalize and reward data-driven decisions. I think we often underestimate the OE or the change management component when you're trying to bring a company along in their customer-centric data journey. So I would say that retailers have acknowledged that internal customer level transaction data is important. But what I have found, particularly in my recent experience, is when you combine that with researchers and market data and store data and mobility data, and you have this epicenter that actually is using all of that information to form a really clear, holistic picture of what's really happening. I think that's where the power is most harnessed after you get through the organizational hurdles around what you do with it once you know it. I think that if a retailer can build a true customer DNA that includes behavior, media exposure, rest of market spending, and a full host of other attributes, and they really actually have that data lake built, they are likely ahead of their peers, and they are way ahead if they're using it to make daily decisions and shape growth strategies.
Thank you for that, and welcome to the show. Happy to have you on the CPG Guys. A little known fact about me that we actually share now, Lisa, we found out is my first job graduating from college was also done by a newspaper ad. I used to advertise back in the days in New York Times. My brother lived up in Jersey. I was down at Virginia wrapping up school, and he would mail clusters of newspapers to me, and I responded to one such ad for IRI. Got called up for the interview, and of course, like you, 3 decades later, it's just gone by in a blur. But I started working not at 19, I started working at 30 years later. So that said, thank you for the start there on the importance of various sources of data and how a nucleus and hub of bringing it together could make a huge difference. Are demographics still primarily relevant in terms of customer understanding? Are they contextual? And segmentation is the way based on their purchasing behavior via those segments? Or what do you see as the limitations of demographics and analytics?
Ooh. Well, I'll give you the short answer, and then I'll back it up with why. But to say that someone's race, income, family size, or what zip code they live in makes them the same is quite frankly naive and lazy. I think that, okay, this is going to be a bit contentious, but if organizations are using demographics as the primary means in which they describe who their core customer is, then they got a lot of work to do to catch up. Unfortunately, What you, Peter, and I know has been an ongoing debate for at least 15 years isn't really as adopted as truth everywhere, in that demographics do play a role. I will say that they do in some limited use cases. I think if you're looking at assortment at a store level, or even if you're a CPG and you're looking at portfolio optimization opportunities, certainly understanding demographic shifts and migrations of different pockets of communities will help you get a little bit better on your assortment offering. But generally, and I have actually proven this, is that demographics are the least predictive variable in what they're going to buy from a food perspective and what retailers are going to choose to shop. And for media, since I know we like to talk a lot about media targeting is far less effective when using demographics. And this has been proven. But last I checked, I don't think retailers are asking for your demographic. When you sign up for a club card or a loyalty program, I don't suspect the demographics is one of the things that you're being asked for. And so then that actually has you rely on third-party companies to do data appends, which in and of itself is giving very broad assumptions of who you are based on the zip code that you live in. So that then asks the question, first of all, there's a lot of conscious and unconscious bias that goes along with it. But imagine your neighbors, Sri. So, think about your neighbors to your left or the right or across the street, and just ask yourself, do you think just because they might be in the same age profile and have the same number of kids that they shop the same way and their pantries look the same? I seriously doubt that to be true. And I think I learned this by taking that same practical example of a neighbor I had who, same age, 2 children, actually oldest being boy, youngest being girl, actually had the same type of car. But she had a special needs child that had a whole host of dietary restrictions that really changed what retailers that she shopped and what food she bought. So that would have never come to light if you were using demographics alone to understand customers.
No, Lisa, my neighbor's demographics wouldn't be the same as me because I started working at 3.
Exactly.
Yeah, I see. Lisa, I couldn't agree more. I think about income, right? Income is not about a propensity. It's about a capacity. And just because they have a capacity doesn't mean they're going to buy it. It may not appeal to them. So I agree with you. I think it does have value contextually. Like if I find a group that I've created based upon a behavior and I want to learn a little bit more about that group, in helping, if I'm looking at people who are buying OTC pain medication very frequently, I'm probably going to find a demographic that says they tend to be a little bit older. But that doesn't necessarily mean I want to target OTC at people who are older because it casts a very wide net and that's not efficient. So I think your point is well made there. Historically, retailers have leveraged the analytic muscle of its key vendor partners to inform their business analytics. They're the people that had an army of analysts just down the street at the local office, right? My question to you is this: is that still the case? How are retailers accessing meaningful insights independent of CPG manufacturers? And what role do you see these business partners playing going forward in the era where you can process an enormous amount of big data without a lot of human intervention?
Yeah, sure. It's a great question. I think that the role of the CPGs and vendor partners and supporting retailers analytically still play a massive role. And I don't think I quite frankly don't think that should change. And let me explain why. The CPG community has such a deep expertise in their brands and categories, while in parallel, you have retailers that have the complexity of geographic and competitive variables. They have the needs of 50 to 100 million households that they're trying to serve, and they're operating across thousands of categories and channels. So retailers need the CPG community to understand the role of their brands in meeting the needs of their shoppers. So what that means is whether their brands are differentiated enough to deliver growth. What are the white space that new innovation is going to serve for that category? And is it going to be incremental? I believe retailers who have been focused on upskilling their organizations using, this is going to probably, we don't like to hear this word, but a hypothesis-driven framework. If you don't know what that is, please research it, especially if you're in a field like mine. Those that have actually upskilled the organization on how to ask the right questions, how to do, I think I know this, but in order for me to take action, I need to confirm these three things. Retailers that know how to work with CPGs in that way and know how to ask those types of questions are going to get far more value from their partnership. I think that if we invest in tool training versus how to actually think, right, and ask the right questions, you're missing the boat, because the tools are the tools. They're just tools. It's really how you operate around those tools that are going to matter most. I think that most retailers shouldn't need vendors to tell them that they're losing customers in a category, or that their market share is shrinking or growing, or even actually to propose new models. I think most retailers have that figured out. I think what retailers need is a CPG to be much more of an expert on their brand buyers at that retailer so that they can build the right plans for growth.
So Lisa, we've kind of declared up front that retailer data sets are quite rich in nature. But if you think about everything on a given register receipt, it's more than just the items purchased and the prices paid for those items. It's a good understanding of the payment format. You talked about geolocation right up front, the register type, time of day, discounts. There's so much more data on that register receipt. How should retailers be thinking about all this extra data other than just the transactional element, and create strategies and actions with such an asset? And then do you think, if it was possible to create such an asset, were there any barriers to putting in front of merchants to use an action with CPG vendors?
Oh, goodness. Yes, and yes. No. Let me dig and unpack that question a little bit. We are not lacking data. I think that the amount of emails or phone calls I get to explore a new data asset is, several a day, right? And so I have to ask myself, and I would encourage anyone in this space to say, okay, will this new data drive different or better knowledge than we had before? Now, sometimes that means that you might be a bit of an incubator. So that's what my team does often, is we will be kind of this incubator of new data sources, and we'll play around with it a little bit. Like, I wonder if is this asset going to give us like a new variable that could make these models stronger? And we may test that out, and we may find like, yeah, it's great contextual information, but the cost to ingest the data, fuse the data, render the data into new reports and systems isn't going to drive a meaningful enough change in making better decisions faster. And therefore, it might not be worth, chasing that data. So I do think it's taking a step back first and really assessing not the data quality is important, but really how is this data going to enhance decision-making? And I think the key is starting with like, well, what decisions do I need to make, and does the business need to make in the coming years? What do we believe to be true today? What needs to be true tomorrow? And is this data going to actually tell me that? I'll give you a perfect use case. So I think it would be of no surprise to anybody that follows this industry that the allocation of subsidized dollars for low-income customers through SNAP has decreased quite a bit over the past year. And I would suspect many retailers are saying, I'm down because of my SNAP business, because SNAP dollars are no longer in the marketplace. And quite frankly, if you're looking at the tender itself and you're only measuring the tender and the sales associated with the SNAP tender, you are going to be freaking out, right? You're going to be like, I am going to be down hundreds of millions of dollars. When in reality, if you combine and you look at it at the household level and what they're spending holistically, you're going to find often that it's a tender shift, that they're actually spending the same amount of money. It's just that they're not actually paying through SNAP. And so that's a perfect example where understanding at the receipt level, the form of payment, is super critical, because you can be chasing dollars that you think you're missing that you're actually not really missing. That would be a perfect example of a good use case for more data.
That is spot on, Lisa. The research I've seen around the implications of the reduction in the emergency SNAP benefits showed a much more decisive impact upon non-consumables and the budget that they're allocating. So you're right, they're shifting it to another transaction that's not SNAP associated with the tender format. It really is other things that are discretionary, that are taking the hit so that they can continue, because they have to consume food to live their lives. I mean, it's crazy. I want to remind our audience that Sri and I are speaking with Lisa Kinney. She's the executive head of customer enterprise and marketing analytics at the Albertsons companies. So Lisa, why don't you give us a flavor for some of the problems that retailers are tackling through analytics? I know that's kind of broad, but I'm sure you've got a couple of examples that would whet the appetites of our audience for how analytics really comes to bear in such enormous organizations.
I'm learning. So one thing I'm learning, Peter, I just learned this year, is that things land so much better when you call problems opportunities.
I'll note that.
Yeah. So I would venture to say that most retailers are trying to win in an environment that have a few challenges. Okay. And so here's what I see from a macro point of view. And I think most retailers and brands will nod their head in this area. We know, and retailers know, that consumers are reacting differently to promotions than they did last year. Period. Some are not able to do the pantry loading to meet the multiples threshold. Things that used to drive a lot of incremental units aren't driving the same amount of incremental units. So what was very elastic last year may not be this year, right? So when you're replicating the same plan you did last year and expecting the same results, I think that many retailers are recognizing that that's not happening, and then having to dig into how do you optimize in that environment. So that's one opportunity, is optimization and recognizing the elasticities look a little different. I'd say another opportunity is really recognizing and understanding format blurring. We talk about channel blurring all the time, because digital is sexy. It's the new thing, right? But I would also say that format blurring is real, and it is happening right now at a faster rate. And what does that mean? So that means we've got pure play value retailers that have grown in their footprint by the thousands over the past 5 years. So while retailers were scrambling on supply chain and just having the right customer service and getting their e-commerce business up and running, all the while, we've had value retailers opening stores by the drones, okay? And not only do we see that happening, but we see them investing in fresh, in chilled, in frozen, that are parts of the store that they were not competing with toe-to-toe with the traditional retailer. So what's happening is, and then we can go on and on about mass and club and the wallet fragmentation that's happening there, but shoppers of all income levels are making trade-offs. All income levels. Okay. And we do a lot of, qualitative research, and we listen to customers and we talk to them, and I'm sure every retailer is doing the same. But the economic challenges that is happening right now is not a low income problem. And if you're a CPG or a retailer thinking that it's about low income folks, then you're really missing a huge event that's happening in the industry. The wallet is leaking. And if retailers aren't careful, they're not going to see it in time, and it's going to result in a market share loss and a P&L loss. Full stop. Right now, retailers can't stop a customer from going into another channel, right? It's going to happen. It is happening. But I think what we need to ask ourselves is, how are the priorities of the consumer changing? How are their hierarchy of needs changed? And what role did we have as an advantage in those needs last year that we don't have this year? And then ask yourself, is that something that we need to fix? Because sometimes it's about riding the ride and knowing that things will come back to a new normal. But I think that shoppers are shopping at Walmart. And it's interesting because I heard a shopper say they wish that they didn't have to. I think she said something to the effect of, nobody even looks like they like being there, right? But she said it's essential to save her family money, and that it would be selfish of her to not, make that extra trip to another. I'm not dogging on Walmart, don't get me wrong, but what I'm saying is that consumers are trading off on things that they were not willing to trade off on before, and now they are. They just can't justify higher prices. And a lot of times they don't want to have to go through a lot of hoops to save money. It's stressful.
I'm going to take you to our favorite topic. Sorry, we couldn't avoid it. And that word is retail media. So here we go. And my favorite word within that retail media ecosystem is full funnel marketing. So I say full funnel retail media because most are focused on the e-commerce, lower funnel aspect. So I'd love to get your viewpoint on the importance of analytics in supporting that lower funnel activation, but more importantly, the full funnel aspect of retail media marketing.
Well, I think the first step is making sure that we know who's in the funnel and what parts of the funnel are connected, right? So that's one of the things that I've noticed is a big challenge is even having the funnel itself mapped to an individual household or customer is often overlooked in a company's data strategy. So if you think about it, you may have web browsing data, media exposure data, email open rates, number of downloads and clicks and all of those things. And oftentimes it sits in like this part of the world in a CPG or a retailer. And then you have all this transactional data that sits over here. And then you have all this store level data and digital transaction data through e-com that sits over here. And if it's not connected, it's not going to be a true full funnel retail media marketing experience, right? So it's critically important for analytics. And I'll give you an example. So if retailers are considering their e-commerce shoppers as different than their in-store shoppers, then they're missing about 80% of the truth. Right. And so if an organization has this team where it's like, my job is to understand the e-commerce customer, and then you have another part of the organization that's like the in-store customer, they're the same people 80% of the time. So first, it's like, we got to debunk some myths that might be happening out there, because how you talk to that customer should be holistic. We need to understand the whole picture of that customer before we start talking about full funnel retail media and marketing. So one is about having the data connected. One is about measurement, looking at what puts and takes are we delivering to that customer? What messaging are we delivering? And here's the scary part. I think as our ability to talk to customers grows and channels, and whether it's on the phone, whether it's text, whether it's web, whether it's TikTok, just because you can talk to them a million times in a week doesn't mean you should. And so one of the things that I'm wondering, and I'm always interested to talk to other retailers about, is how do you prioritize the media and the marketing experience, right? How are you prioritizing who wins that moment for messaging? I'll give you an example. Well, I mean, I'd like to say, if we can talk to them every hour, every day, and if retailers let the vendor and CPG community dictate that based on their wallet, because we have a revenue target to hit for, alternative revenue, you may hit that number, but the experience with your customers and not really having an identity because it's become the CPG identity is really going to compromise the retailer's relationship with their shoppers. So I would say have a customer strategy, know the role that, the different touch points play in articulating your value proposition. And then what role does the CPG play in augmenting that? If you start with the CPG and the funding and then let it flow through, I think that, it'll be a regrettable decision a few years from now.
Lisa, I can only echo what you just said. After we parted ways in Cincinnati and I moved to Rhode Island, I worked for a retailer that at the time, its primary mechanism for communication was email. And the way it allocated email was based upon an equitable distribution, equitable based upon the number of divisions. So on Monday, this division could have it. On Tuesday, this group or this division. And that division might have been the photo group. The photo group got just as much airplay in terms of owning email as the loyalty group. And that was not based upon an understanding of what drove the most return. It was just, well, they're a division, they get a full day, and that's just the way it is. So I agree with you. Just because you can doesn't mean you should. And you really have to understand what's going to drive the most relevance for your consumer, and ultimately what is going to deliver the most return back to the retailer and the brand. All right. So in that vein around customer centricity, if you're a retailer or a brand, you're trying to create a customer-centric, data-driven culture, how do you really get started? What are some of the lessons that you've learned throughout your career you can share to help people in our audience in this discipline really accelerate success and avoid some of the pitfalls that you and I know have run into in our time in this industry?
Man, this could be a whole episode in and of itself, Peter. I could teach a whole, because there should be a degree on how to do this, honestly, because it is.
We'll talk to you afterwards, Lisa. We're working on
curriculum on this topic because it's actually the most under-discussed topic. There are many forums and classes around data and tools and models and AI ML. And this in and of itself is probably the most difficult, part of the process. So I've worked with a lot of global and US-based retailers, many, many CPGs, and have seen the full spectrum of barriers based on where they are in the maturity curve. Probably going to be a little blunt in some cases, but I can't help myself because it's really my experience I live and breathe and have for many years. But if a retailer or brand wants to become customer-centric, data-driven, it's important to know what they think that really means, right? Are you signing up to have a customer strategy that you're going to stick to? Or are you still going to chase anyone that has a wallet that looks a little bit bigger than it did yesterday, right? So let's have those conversations. I think that retailers need to be honest with themselves and brands need to be honest with themselves on when they say they want to be data-driven and customer-centric, what does that actually mean? And what are you truly signing up for? It means that the organization is going to have to upskill their talent and be willing to change their operating models around planning and decisioning, right? There's a process change that comes along with that. It means that they need to have an unbiased function. I'm not sure where organizationally that sits for everyone, but you do have to have an unbiased function that's really not wed to a specific business pillar or P&L so that they can be the filter of truth. And that's not, I'd say very few retailers have that function as well, or CPG brands. They're usually allocated to a specific business function. So here's a few things that hold true and remain pitfalls. A customer strategy needs to be defined, tenable, and measurable, right? And I think that oftentimes I'll see customer strategies out there and I'm like, well, what does that mean? Like, how are you going to know if it's working? What does that actually look like in a metric? Can you measure it? The other thing is about test, learn, and scale fast. I like to use this. Agile doesn't mean being fickle, right? So again, like sometimes you have to test, measure, scale, and you have to have the patience. And then the other thing is that CX is not just owned by the digital team. That's another barrier that I see where it's like, I'm responsible for the customer experience. And I'm like, well, aren't we all responsible for the customer experience? Don't we all share those metrics? So anyway, I could go on and on. But the pitfalls that I would avoid is waiting to solve for process and people while you're building the tools or the data solutions. So the analogy of if you build great tools, they will come has never played out in my experience. I have seen investment in tools and capabilities that, in and of themselves are fantastic, but go nowhere and drive zero business benefit because they haven't solved the whole the operating model around it, nor the talent upskilling that's required as well. So that's a huge pitfall. The other thing that I'm seeing is as these new data science teams are created and they're building really fantastic models, what often I'm seeing happen is that they don't have a business partner that helps them render what the model is saying out to the business, if that makes any sense. So there will be models that are like running, that are super powerful, that can tell you whether or not you have customers that are going to churn in the next 3 months, or models that'll tell you that this new flavor is starting to trend upwards, but they are just sitting and running in the background. And there's nobody that's actually saying, well, is that going to go in a report? Are we going to report against this and what the model is saying? And so oftentimes these functions are considered not to be delivering business value. And it's because they don't have a business partner that's working through how do you bring the output of the model to the business to actually drive decisions. And I think that those are two missing connections. So I guess my advice in a nutshell, because I'm probably being long-winded here, is if you're embarking on this journey, know what you're signing up for and make sure that the business truly wants what they're asking for. And if it's just a data monetization strategy, then just call it that. Just call it what it is. So here's my rah-rah.
I remember sitting in front of a chief merchant after having delivered the results of a customer centricity assessment. You remember what those are, Lisa. And this merchant, who shall remain nameless, had sought to institute a new platform for analytics. working with an external partner. We all know who all the players are in that space. And I advocated, I said, if you want to instill a new platform and you want to monetize it, it's only going to be meaningful if, one, you deliver meaningful tools. But more importantly, to your point, Lisa, if you actually make decisions based upon those insights. You have to make customer-centric decisions. And this merchant said to me, all I care about is monetizing. And I said, then what's going to happen is they may subscribe the first year. It's all going to come out of the trade fund. And after they realize no decisions are made, they won't re-up on the investment. Then it's just a tax. And you haven't solved the problem. Customer centricity is about, to your point, fundamentally changing the decisions you make that are underpinned by the tools that will enable you to make those decisions based on customer centricity. Sri, I'll pass it on to you.
Thank you so much for that, Peter. And thank you for making that point about customer centricity as well. Lisa, this last question comes back to you and your career. Those that want to follow in your footsteps and be a data and analytics expert, period, not just on the retail side, but in the industry in general, that includes the CPG side. If you could go back, pull that newspaper again when you decided to respond to the trade marketing job, what advice would you give to them that you've learned over the last 3 odd decades in terms of all this dynamic change we're seeing in the industry? The job today is nothing like it probably was 30 years ago, just when you think of the amount of data as well as the toolkits to analyze them, and then the ability to present them, they've all changed in 3 decades.
Yeah, I love spending time with people early in their career and helping them think through what are their personal hierarchy of needs today, right? And if you think about when you're planning out, like, what's your next job, what's your next role, what looks important to you today and may rank at the top 3, that are non-negotiable, may look very different 30 years later, right? So number one, it's okay to change your mind. So that's why I always try and tell my kids, like, you're allowed to change your mind. However, I would not change any of my experiences, and I'm so glad that I stayed in this industry. But here's some words of wisdom that I have. So take the time to learn how decisions are made. Like, how are decisions made? Go in with a very curious mindset, whether you're heavily on the analytic side or you're more on the sales side or you're supporting more of the sales functions in the business. Make sure you understand all the critical roles that you will be working with. And that's so important because you have to have relationships. They have to feel comfortable being vulnerable with you, saying, I actually think I made this decision and I'm not sure it was the right one. Can you help me look at the data and see what the impact was? You're talking about people that are pretty senior, likely, who have never had to work with this type of information. And they're exposing themselves to you by saying, I don't know, and I'm not sure. And you don't get that by being the best analyst in the world. You get that by taking the time to understand them, their role, their pain points. So if that means you have to take a few jobs to get like a broader perspective on those actual roles that you're trying to influence in the future, then do it. Even if that means you need to move to a couple of different functions or a couple of different companies to get that. So again, I think our roles are people roles. We think that we're data roles, but I actually believe that my job is more of a people-focused function than it is a data-focused function in order to be successful. So maybe for others, that's not the case. Staying curious and humble. I remember when, you and I worked with so many CPGs and retailers, and even in the global space, a lot of the barriers are the same. But I used to sit there and say, I just don't understand why they don't get it. Why are they not making these decisions? It's so black and white, like it's the right thing to do for the customer, and all the data says so. Until you're walking a mile in their shoes and until you sit inside a retailer and you see truly the complexity of what they're trying to manage every day, it's a lot easier to sit on the outside, being the prophet of customer, when in reality, building that empathy has been a huge blessing for me to be actually working inside a retailer and seeing it. So stay curious, be humble. And here's the last piece, and this might be, I believe that it's important, but in this type of role, in any kind of data or analytics function, or even in a consulting function, you need to be okay knowing that your work may have actually manifested itself into something big. Like you may have helped a company, go from $20 million to $100 million. And you know that you were a part of that thinking, right? But you have to be almost okay smiling from a distance and knowing your role in helping the organization get there. I call it's almost like being a proud parent when they see their children flourish. Far too often, you're not going to get a call from your kids saying, like, I'm successful today because of all these things that you've done over the years to help me get to this place, right? That just doesn't happen. However, given that insight and analytic roles can be often undervalued in organizations, take your time making sure that the company you're considering working for or the role that you're considering taking places the same value on your contributions or that function's contributions as they do for a business that has a P&L inside that company, right? And there's a whole host of CPGs and retailers. You're not limited by options. I would just say take the time to truly understand, like, what value do they place on this capability or this skill set? And sometimes, like for me, I like learning. And so I know I can be the man behind the mirror or behind the curtain and be the silent person in the room watching a company transform themselves. But for others, they may need to thrive on something different and need different recognition. And they just need to be sure what company they're doing that at can do that for them.
Lisa, I've always thought of you as not only the person behind the curtain, but the mighty and powerful Oz all rolled into one. So to our audience, I want to remind you, please visit cpgguys.com. You can find all of our episodes there, easily filterable by your favorite topic. You want to find people like Lisa who are experts in analytics. Just choose analytics as a filter. You can find those episodes. Or, of course, our favorite topic, retail media. And, of course, if you think you or your company has some thought leadership to share with this community we've established in this ongoing conversation, drop us a line at contact@cpgguys.com. And maybe you can join us for a future episode of the CPG Guys podcast. Lisa, thanks for coming on board. I know we talk about retail media a lot here, but my DNA starts at customer centricity and analytics. And I was so pleased that we had a broad reaching, but some really meaty feedback from you and thoughts that I think our audience will take to heart as they go forward. Really so happy to reconnect with you, and I'm looking forward to running into you as you are undercover at one of the future industry conferences. I'm not going to name any, but you and I both know where we'll see each other. But thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thanks so much for having me. It's been fun to get out from behind the curtain this afternoon. So it's been great.
That's great. Hey, Shri, I'm going to turn to you. I thought this was phenomenal. I love this conversation. I would love for you to share with us some of the highlights of what Lisa talked about that really resonated for you.
Well, first of all, when you declared right up front that she's moved to Southern California, I think the episode was over because we already put a big check mark on this episode rocks. So do I need to continue further, Lisa? In any event, I will. So what a cool role, working with senior leaders across many levels in the organization, all things data, all things analytics, all things strategy. We found we have a common thread being hired from a paper ad, although I was only 3 years old when I started applying. But I would say when someone says, I've been in the industry for 30 years or 3 decades, you call them an authority in the field that they are in. And that's what Lisa's work in analytics is, an authority. Then we talked about all data sources being valuable in some capacity. They become even more valuable when you take transaction data, mobility, store data as examples, put it in an epicenter, and forms the best data set you can work with when you combine them. And the advice, keep it focused on the customer DNA and allow media exposure as often as possible. We asked a question about segmentation and demographics, because largely the industry has followed clustering via segmentation and actions, but clearly that's outdated these days. And a lot of work is required by many companies to play catch up in that space. Simple reason, it encourages bias of all sorts in behavior and actions that are put out for the customer. Retailers do, however, need the CPG community to understand brands and the ability to connect their brand into the customer for outcomes in terms of offers, maybe innovation, the portfolio that should stay at the shelf. So that was a key message that retailers do, in fact, need to understand brands. And then I jump further into the hypothesis-driven framework. What retailers need to hear from CPGs to be an expert on how their shopper is, rather than hide the shopper data, and work together on what we call joint business plans, or just plans in general to execute at the shelf, online or offline. Lisa did mention be an incubator of to test new data sets and always be open in your mind to test new data sets. She gave us the great example of how in the last 3 years, the reliance of the consumer wallet and SNAP benefits has mattered a lot. So not testing that data set and not making decisions with that data set is actually a miss. A great example of incubating a new data set. And the last few years have made her reflect on, I would say, quote, problems as double quote opportunities. You know that's going to get hashtagged in the LinkedIn post that this podcast will be at. And then we moved on from there to the reference of a format blurring. Pure Play was a great example of format blurring, how now fresh, frozen, and chilled has taken off a different meaning of itself, and thinking of the consumer as one. In-store and e-commerce does converge. Those that don't think of it that way are missing out on 80% of the opportunities they may have in front of them, or 80% of the consumer or the household, that particular household wallet. She encouraged all retailers to connect the data that's available that they have from transaction in store to data from apps, websites, e-commerce, bring it together for the statement we just made earlier. It's 80% of what a household does. And then the customer strategy that subsequently, which will allow it to be refined and also be measurable in the process. And made a quote that I think we both agree on here on the CPG guys, which is the responsibility for the customer experience doesn't solely lie on just a merchant or a website builder. It's all of us who work in this industry. Because at the end of the day, our mission is the same. We try to deliver for the shopper, the customer in this case, from a retailer lens. And then a very valuable one, I think, was the reference to keep the truth teller outside the business unit. So indeed, they can continue to tell the truth and not the story what a business unit wants to hear. That one is a very important one. And then she closed out with advice to get into this industry, have a blossoming career in this industry, be curious. I'll tell you, curiosity can't be taught. You either have it or you don't. So be the one that has it. Show up. Be humble. Take laterals if you have to learn. And then take time to understand and wear the shoes of the person that you're serving in this analytics capacity. It is a people business. Without collaboration, you won't be successful. But lastly, and I would say that's advice for everybody listening to this podcast, not just analytics, be at a place that recognizes your work. How did I do, Lisa?
That's amazing.
There we go, Sri. Great summary. Really appreciate it. And as always, Sri, thanks for joining me on this continuing conversation. To our audience, I want to say thank you so much for joining in this continuing conversation. To the nearly 24,000 followers on LinkedIn who turn to us for education and entertainment, we're so grateful you do. Sri, we're getting very close to celebrating 25,000. And I think at current pace, we're going to be able to celebrate 1 million downloads before Christmas. So lots going on here. But thanks so much for joining us. And we look forward to speaking with you on the next episode of, wait for it, the CPG Guys podcast. Goodbye.
The content in this podcast episode is provided for general informational purposes only. By listening to our episode, you understand that no information contained in this episode should be construed as advice from CPG Guys LLC or the individual author, hosts, or guests, nor is it intended to be a substitute for research on any subject matter. Reference to any specific product or entity does not constitute an endorsement or recommendation by CPG Guys LLC. The views expressed by guests are their own, and their appearance on the program does not imply an endorsement of them or any entity they represent. The views expressed by CPG Guys LLC do not represent the views of their employers or the entity they represent. CPG Guys LLC expressly disclaims any and all liability or responsibility for any direct, indirect, incidental, special, consequential, or other damages arising out of any individual's use of, reference to, or inability to use this podcast or the information we present in this podcast.